Eddie, talk to me. Eddie, are you there? Eddie? Eddie?
I am in a situation with American to learn the possible hijack.
The unthinkable happened today. The World Trade Center, both towers, gone.
We believe that a plane has crashed into the World Trade Center in New York.
Año escolar también inició la temporada.
The first aircraft to depart, Flight 11, took off at 7:59 a.m. Following on from this, we see Flight 175 also departing from Boston Airport exactly 15 minutes later. The first alert to American Airlines came in at 8:19 a.m. to report that Flight 11 had been hijacked. Within the next minute, we see the third aircraft, Flight 77, departing from Dulles International Airport. Up until 8:42 a.m, we see the flights continuing along their intended flight path until Flight 175 loses communication to air traffic control and is considered hijacked. At a similar time, the last flight, 93, departs from Newark International Airport. With all the planes now in the air, the downward spiral begins.
The World Trade Center sees its first devastation as Flight 11 crashes into the North World Trade Tower at 8:46 a.m. In the meantime, Flight 77 also becomes hijacked. Flight 175 hits the South Tower at 9:03 a.m, creating catastrophic damage to the entirety of the infrastructure. Despite two planes having already crashed, Flight 77 is next hitting the Pentagon at 9:37 a.m, with Flight 93 becoming hijacked 2 minutes later. Despite passengers attempting to regain control of the plane, hijackers decided to put an end to the flight path, instead leading the plane to crash in a field near Pennsylvania, just before 10 o'clock in the morning.
Following these devastating events, the disaster caused was yet to prevail.
All 266 passengers and crew on the four planes lost their lives upon impact, totaling 2,997 deaths, including lives lost at the World Trade Center and those from suicide.
An additional 6,000 people were injured from these attacks, largely from falling debris.
The North and South Towers in the World Trade Center were reduced to rubble as a result of its collapse, with other buildings nearby suffering great damage, such as the Deutsche Bank building, which was later demolished.
Following on from these physical losses, the impact to both the American and global economy was extensive. The New York Stock Exchange closed for 4 days, the first time since the Great Depression, whilst the US economy experienced $21 billion worth of losses resulting from insurance claims and property loss.
Consequently, the budget for defence saw a $30 billion increase introduced by President Bush.
Unemployment levels rose sharply, with 143,000 jobs lost across New York City.
The aviation industry too saw a massive loss, with several airlines going bankrupt and the rate of air travel only beginning to increase again in 2005, highlighting the fear instilled into people due to their perception of a terrorist threat.
The devastation continued for years after this disaster, with a minimum of 422,000 New Yorkers suffering from PTSD due to the severity of the event.
As the towers burned, they released toxic fumes into the atmosphere, which increased vulnerability to the workers and residents as they were exposed to pollutants during the period of recovery and reconstruction.
Statistics in 2018 showed that a secondary hazard, exposure to toxic fumes, caused 10,000 people to be diagnosed with 9/11 related cancer.
Before 9/11, a bombing had also occurred below the World Trade Center in 1993, in which 6 people lost their lives and over 1,000 people were injured.
Similar events have also occurred worldwide, such as in November 1989 when 110 innocent people were killed in Colombia after Avianca Flight 203 is bombed.
The underlying motivations for the disaster of 9/11 are highly conflicted amongst sources, which takes us back to investigate the organisations involved in order to determine what caused this attack.
We first see direct intent to harm the US in August of 1996 when Osama bin Laden, a Saudi fugitive, issued a declaration of war against the United States.
2 years later, this spiralled into the creation of the World Islamic Front for Jihad, an alliance of terrorist groups intent on attacking the United States and its allies, formed by Osama bin Laden.
The principal theory of motivation is that the hijackers were acting in retaliation to America's support of Israel and their continued military presence in the Middle East.
The 19 hijackers involved with this act of terrorism were also from Saudi Arabia and several other Middle Eastern nations, and it is reported to have been financed by the Al-Qaeda terrorist organisation of bin Laden. There were further vulnerability issues which increased the risk to the citizens of the United States, allowing the hijackers to cause maximum damage.
The state of airport security was insufficient before 9/11, with fewer than 20,000 airport security screeners, which were then unable to detect possible threats found on passengers such as guns and bombs.
Specifically, passengers were allowed to carry liquids on board, which meant liquid bombs could go undetected.
In addition to this, the cockpit was not sealed on flights, which opened up the opportunity for hijackers to take over aeroplanes, leaving the pilots vulnerable at any given point.
Aside from the problems detected with the US airport security, the construction of the World Trade Center opened up vulnerabilities. At the time of the disaster, the building was privately owned, meaning investment was not spent to prevent the building collapsing in the then unlikely event of a terrorist attack.
The combination of these vulnerabilities left New York and other American states exposed to the risk of this hazard.
The first response actually came from those trapped within the building.
The Deputy Fire Safety Director was located in the lobby, and whilst he was unaware of the exact details of the incident, he began to follow protocol. This involved advising those who could hear the computerised alarms to descend to points of safety until further instructions were available.
Many public announcements weren't heard within the building because of the damage caused by the explosion. This led to an influx of 911 calls. 911 operators were unaware of the exact location of the fire, so decided to follow standard procedures for high-rise fires. Stay and wait for emergency services to rescue them.
We had about 100 people up here. Sit tight. Do not leave, okay? There's a fire or an explosion or something in the building. All right, I want you to stay where you are.
10 minutes after the first crash, the New York Police Department began to advise people to evacuate the building. Efforts were made to assess the possibility of rooftop landings, and this was communicated via 911 operators to civilians, which encouraged people to ascend. However, it was later deemed too dangerous and resulted in people becoming stuck at the top of a burning building.
Unfortunately, within 10 minutes of impact, smoke was beginning to rise rapidly and left many people with no choice but to jump from the building.
As for the South Tower, a major problem was that after the first evacuation order, the South Tower public address system began an announcement stating that the South Tower building was safe and employees should return to their offices, reversing their initial decision to evacuate. For 15 minutes after the initial dispatch of NYPD and the FDNY, tenants were told to stay inside the building and not evacuate. This lack of knowledge about the scale of the event and ineffective communication ultimately hindered the recovery approach, as both the police and fire departments did not coordinate their units.
Outside of the World Trade Center, clogged roads prevented ambulance to the main hospitals, which delayed the overall response times for medical assistance.
Since this disaster, efforts for rehabilitation have been made, including the creation of Patriots Day on September 11th, after being approved by Congress in 2001. Here, development comes under the rehabilitation stage, as the 9/11 Memorial was constructed in place of the Trade Center with the aim to honour the victims lost and aid the grieving process for those affected by this disaster.
However, the initial media coverage created a hindrance to the public regarding their mental welfare. A censorship was made difficult on a live broadcast. For many networks, graphic images were broadcasted, which led to thousands of PTSD diagnosed across the US.
Since 9/11, the positive lessons learned have been how to reduce the likelihood of a similar event occurring again.
We see changes to airport security have been made following a total $100 billion investment into these resources. Additionally, baggage is now checked using advanced technology X-ray, which screens all checked baggage and uses explosive trace detectors to intercept prohibited items.
America has increased its preparedness by making emergency planning a priority, by training law enforcement in infrastructure protection and providing them access to Tripwire. This is an online information sharing network which contains the latest information on terrorist tactics.
Terrorist attacks still continue today, causing disaster to those affected, demonstrating that mitigation efforts cannot guarantee the prevention of a terrorist attack. It is difficult to prevent or mitigate future attacks, as terrorists are constantly innovating on how to elude the systems in place.